Hi, and welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast hosted by Hema Lomax and me, Lisa Fine. We are sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insights and produced by the Compliance Podcast Network. Today's guest is Maria Lancri, who is truly a global leader in ethics and compliance. Maria is a partner at Squair, based in Paris, and has experience both in law firms and in-house, spending 12 years at Hachette Livre, Hachette Books for English speakers like me. She is a member of the steering committee at Sorbonne D.U. Compliance and Ethique des Affairs. I, again, do not want to offend all of the French with my terrible accent. I was so lucky, Maria, to get to spend time with you a few weeks ago. Greatest dinner companion, and immediately wanted to share her wealth of experience and all of her knowledge with you in the quick community. So thank you so much for being here. And can you tell everybody about your career and your career path?
Thank you, Lisa, for having me. It's really a great honor for me. I don't know if I'm the first French person you're having on this podcast. But anyway, to let you know a little about myself, I studied both in France and in the US, actually in Texas at SMU in Dallas. And that's why we met 2 weeks ago, because while we were at the SCC conference, I also went back on campus and addressed the international students at SMU. It was also another great opportunity. After that, I went back to France and I started to work in law firms. And all of my career, I've been dealing with international issues, first in litigation and arbitration. And then progressively, I moved to regulation and to what we call now compliance. I started compliance in-house at Hachette Livre, Hachette Books for you, as you say. And I really enjoyed it, and I thought that I wanted to spend more time on these issues when I went back to private practice, and that's what I have been doing since I went back to private practice. And actually, I went back to private practice a year before the Sapin II law.
That is actually just almost putting me right into my first big question, because people refer to Sapin II all the time. And it's thinking of it as the legal framework for combating corruption and bribery. But a lot of people in the US or other places may not know more. So can you give a primer to us about Sapin II, why it's so significant and how it's grown?
Okay, it's significant because it's a law that was taken by France, because the reports that were drafted by the OECD and the application of the convention were really bad on France, saying that France was not fighting enough against corruption. And after consulting many countries, after having visited the DOJ and the SFO in the UK, they came up with that idea that preventively they should make it mandatory for big companies to implement an anti-corruption compliance program. So the law is mainly on compliance. It's not on criminal offenses, because the criminal offenses already existed in the criminal code, but the problem was that they were not sufficiently used and applied. They thought that we didn't have enough sanctions, enough condemnations on that basis. Although we had more on some other criminal offenses that were more easily punishable than corruption. And also in the same Sapin II law, you have what we call the CGIP, which is the equivalent of the American DPA, that allowed settlements with the prosecutor on criminal offenses, which is a first for corporate entities in France. So this is why people have been talking about Sapin II. It's that it's a preventive law about implementing a compliance program, which is carefully detailed in the law, and then even more so in the guidelines that were issued after that by the agency in charge of the implementation of the law, which is called the French Anti-Corruption Agency. In French, it's AFA, Agence Française Anticorruption.
Yeah. And I remember one of my first exposures to it was years ago, about the hotline and how to deal with the issues related to whistleblower hotlines. And it's a fascinating, because I learned more of what I didn't know when I started to learn about the EU and then SEPNDA and all of the various regulations. So to this day, what are you seeing in your practices, especially is it still aligned the SEPNDA framework? How has it evolved?
It all depends on the companies. Obviously, the biggest companies, the listed companies that have to render their annual report public,
Mhm.
they are much more compliant than the smallest ones that are still above the threshold of application because they are not under the scrutiny of the public nor of the agency, the AFA I was talking about. Because the AFA has a power to go and audit the companies that are submitted to the SAP and the law. And we have to admit that they concentrated on the biggest companies. And they have been saying that they would go and check smaller companies that have around between 3,000 and 500 employees. And they haven't done it much these last 2 years because it seems that they spent much more time auditing public entities and government agencies. So that's why some people are saying to us, this is not going to happen. So why should we care? Why should we comply? That's really an issue for some of the companies and for us, the professionals.
And I guess one of my questions too is the SEPNDA, and you're also part of obviously the EU. So are there situations where you may be either in a conflict or is there any of the views that may be slightly different, and how can you handle those sorts of things if they do exist?
No, I don't think there is really any conflict of law regarding corruption.
Mhm.
The thing is that although I was just saying that it's not applied the way we professionals were dreaming of. I think the law has been influencing the EU. First of all, with the whistle directive that entered into force 2 years ago now, because it was very much inspired by what we had done in France. And it means that now, although it's a directive and not a regulation, but we have more or less the same text applying in the 26, 27 countries of the EU. And also there is another text that is being discussed, which is a corruption directive. The Parliament and the Commission are trying to come up with a definitive text of that directive to be hopefully implemented, definitively voted this year or beginning of next year, which is proposing this time to implement these preventive compliance programs all over Europe. So we're going to see if it goes all the way to the adoption process of the EU, but that's also a way to influence the EU that we can see, and also a way to develop the application of the compliance principles and of the OECD principles.
It's interesting. And one other point I've always noticed in attention for in the whistleblower directive is the how do you interpret the local presence for something? Because one of the challenges can be, at least speaking from my outside the EU perspective, is that people are very concerned, and using a whistleblower hotline is often a last resort if they feel there's not anything else they can use. So I'm always fearful that if there's too much saying you must go local for that very few people who really don't feel comfortable, we want to make sure that they know they can have another option, but then on the other hand, not violate what the spirit is of the EU directive.
I understand your point because actually most of us, we didn't understand where the commission wanted to go with this thing about keeping it local, because oftentimes, especially when the local subsidiary is too small, we're going to know who is the whistleblower and he may be retaliated against. So what's the point? Not always, but I oftentimes thought that it was better to go and make the report to the group. Hopefully it's a sane environment and they're going to take care of it, rather than staying at the level and of the local subsidiary. But that's the way it has been implemented. So we have to deal with it. And maybe when they review the directive a few years from now, they're going to take into consideration experience and see whether it was an advantage to go locally or not.
Yeah, it is a big challenge, especially because if the local people decide they've handled it and it turns out to become an issue that the whole company is liable for. I think all of us are working through it in different ways because we really do want to do the right thing. And
Yeah, but I understand what you
yeah,
said earlier was interesting because you have to make them know also that they can refer to the group in case they feel that they didn't get the proper answer from the local subsidiary, because the other alternative, you don't want to see it because they can go
no,
outside the group. They can go to the media, and that's another story that we don't want to hear about.
no, especially if the organization wants to do the right. I mean,
Yeah,
if you don't know, you
exactly.
can't do it. And there's nothing worse. People I think might be nodding right now. There's nothing worse than if you're in an organization and you hear about something that went wrong for the first time in the media. That's
Yeah,
not a good day. One of the things, and I'm just going to go a little bit more into these cultural things, but one of the things that you said in the Cosmos interview, which I reread the other day and with the SCCE, was talking about the differences between the European and the American approach to compliance. I work in a British company. I'm not exactly sure how I'm fitting them in, but somewhere in the middle. But one of the things that you said is that in the US, we often say, show me that what you did, or the government says, show me that what you did is efficient and adequate. And while the EU tends to say, show me that what you did is what I asked for. Can you expand about that and how that you impact professionals and in organizations?
sure. I think that the best way to understand that comment is if you compare the guidelines issued by the DOJ and the ones issued by the AFA, the French agency. If you take the evaluation of corporate compliance programs document from the DOJ and the guidelines issued by the AFA for the implementation of the Sapender law, I think the American document is like 15 pages, something like that. And ours is, I don't know, 60 pages or even more than that. Okay. And if you look at the risk assessment section, it's 10 lines in the American document. It says, show me that the technique you used to do the risk assessment was efficient enough for you to identify which are your highest risks.
Okay.
And in the French document, you have 10 pages explaining you what process you should be following to do a proper risk assessment.
Mhm.
And if you're not following that process, you have to explain why you didn't do it and why it is as efficient as the one that they are supposedly proposing. By law, it's supposedly only proposing, but you have to show that it's as efficient. And we as professionals, we always complain about that. But many times when we go to meetings with the agency, you see people asking for for more details. Could you explain us how to do the evaluation of third parties? Or you have issued a guideline on this and that subject, but you think this on this page is not detailed enough. Could you make a new version to detail it enough? Because in a way, they won't do it if it's not written.
Mhm.
And it's not, for some companies, is because they don't want to do it. So that's the excuse.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not written, I'm not doing it, because we are not not common law countries. But some other companies, it's not that they don't want to do it, it's that they're afraid of doing it wrongly. So they say, you have to detail exactly what I have to do, and I'm going to follow that path. So that's, for me, it's a problem, because if you write too much in the guidelines of the governmental agency, then you are stuck with their reasoning. You cannot expand, you cannot take into consideration the specifics of the company you are advising, either internally or externally. That's my point.
Yeah. And the concern that I have with that generally is that we spend a lot of time in the direction that I think a lot of the US and UK, I think too, is making sure that you have the right sort of targeted program for your organization so that people can make the right decisions easily. The other side, I get worried about more of the bureaucracy. On the up, it increases accountability, but it isn't the right thing. And the reason I mentioned that to you is one of my favorite topics is the idea of ethical decision making and how do we empower people to do the right thing. And how does that kind of align with you basically making sure you use the process that will keep you in good stead, which maybe doesn't help people make right decisions. They're making the get out of trouble or legal decisions. Do you think that's a possibility?
Before going completely to that question, I wanted to finish maybe my reasoning because I
Okay.
don't want people to have the wrong impression and to believe that what people are doing in compliance in France and maybe in some other European countries, it's on the paper. The thing is that it's not because they want to follow a certain process that they are not going to try to see whether it's efficient or not.
Mhm.
Okay. And because I think that they are concerned about taking an ethical decision. That was the next question.
Mhm.
And I think that if we can get out of the corruption issues and get into ESG, maybe or where we can see the main differences with the US these days. And I'm sorry for that, but that's the way it is.
Me too. I'll put that out there. I'm not thrilled about it either.
And so if you can, you have all noticed that change is coming from the EU on ESG matters rather than from the US. And it's not only because it's becoming mandatory by law or by the directives that the EU has issued, it's also because people believe that it is the right thing to do. And the whole point of implementing in the EU what the Commission has called the Green Deal is to change the minds, to make sure that we're going to find solutions to make lives better on our planet. And I think that through that change, you can see that people have ethics in their mind when they are implementing the ESG programs. The thing is that they have to fight different trends. One is oftentimes they have to fight with their US shareholders, uh, meaning mainly the funds, because they want to have an immediate return on their investment. And by implementing ESG programs, you are slowing down the return, obviously. You have to see it on the long way and not shortly. And the other thing is that you have to educate people at your company and maybe mainly educate boards where oftentimes you have older people and who have to understand what are the targets and why they have to change their mind and get adapted to these sustainability issues. So I think that's an important way to see where ethics are in Europe.
It's an excellent way to think about it, and you are the lead on all of that. Now, you just mentioned this with boards, but I'm going to throw it into the boards or other perspectives. Cultural norms, even as we're talking in this conversation, they may lead to conflicting approaches when you're in a global organization or even in your team. Do you have in your experience, particular strategies that you use to address them? I mean, you just used a great one right now, refocusing in the right way and making me understand the perspective on ESG. But what do you do in those situations where you've got all those competing factors?
I can share you a training I participated to 20 years ago. We had a case study. I was in a global law firm at that time, and they presented us with a case study, and each one of us was from a different country. And we had to see what were the reactions and the difference in the reactions from one lawyer from one country and another one from another country. And that was really interesting because obviously the case was really topical so that we would see immediately the differences. But that's easy way to understand that there
Mhm.
are differences and that when you actually work, you have to take them into consideration. And what I noticed oftentimes is that when someone writes to a colleague from another country, they present their question from their own point of view and they don't try to explain why they are asking a question because it has a link to their culture or to their own laws. And it would make life much easier to the recipient of the message if they understand why the question is being asked, so that they see whether we have the same issue or not in the country where we receive the question. I hope you understand where I'm getting.
Mhm.
And the other things to do, and I'm fighting with my clients so that they do it, but because of the budget restrictions, they don't do it. They have to travel to the subsidiaries.
Yeah.
It's the only way to understand what are their needs. And also, I had to fight with an American client last year. I had to make the compliance officer in the US understand that the French company had to adapt the global procedure. So I understand perfectly the need of having a global procedure, but I also understand the need for the countries to adapt it to their country when it's needed by law or by culture.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point, and I've seen that in my career as well, because I really do like when you have kind of the basic whatever something is, and then different addendums and information, because you do have to do that, and even it's hard when it's conflicting and it's never perfect, but you really do have to negotiate those things through. One of my favorite things is the difference in ways certain conversations. My former company was based in Switzerland, in the Swiss German side. And one of the parts that always amazed me is I'd get an email about something and it would be like, you know, "Oh, Pleasant, I hope you're doing well. It was so great to see you last week. This is why you are wrong with the following four things." And then, oh boy. And then the last sentence is, "Let's have drinks when you're in town in 2 weeks." And for a little while, for me, I was confused, but then I realized this is somebody we like each other. They didn't like something I did in a work project, or we disagreed, but that's just work. Once I learned that, I laughed about it, because eventually we all did, because for me, it came out at first like this, what just happened? And then you learn. I find those things to be fascinating as well. And you made me think about that when you were talking about giving the why to people, because the why is really important. And I'm going to change to one other topic where the EU is leading and where you've been speaking and well known on it is AI. You're leading on it, and it's similar to how you've led in GDPR and also in sustainability and ESG. What do you see as a key issue for organizations over the next 12 to 18 months?
Okay. I have to say that some people complain about the AI Act because they say that it's going to block the development of initiatives in AI, the same way the medical devices directive is blocking development of medical devices because it's too demanding. That's a way to see it. Another way is to see it more like the GDPR, as you just mentioned, or even the product safety directive, where it explains you what is the path that you have to follow to make sure that the product you are commercializing is safe enough and protecting enough the consumer. And the consumer, or here, the people whose data you're going to be using. So I think it's interesting, but it has to be handled carefully. And it shouldn't be left into the hands of engineers and IT guys. It's something, again, that we have to share with them, we lawyers or compliance people, because you need the knowledge of these different people to make sure that you're going to develop something that is useful, but safe enough. And again, as with all the IT tools, we have to be careful of the way we develop the specifications. Because a tool is made of the specifications and the way you develop the algorithm. Sometimes I had IT guys telling me, it's not my fault, it's the algorithm. Yeah, but there was someone who developed the algorithm and who thought that it should be thinking that way or that other way. So that's where we have to make sure that people, when they develop the specifications, understand where stand the high risks and try to mitigate them. I think that's the most important thing. For us as professional users of AI tools. I think that we have to use them to get used to them, but to always check the information and challenge the result. And for us who are older, we have to make sure that the young people, the young teams understand that they have to challenge, because we have to train them and they are not going to be trained the same way we have been trained.
Right.
So we have to make them understand that it's not because it's written on their computer that it's okay. They have to check the information.
Yeah. And the amount of information that people get these days compared to back in my day, back in the olden days, is so different. Thank you for that. And you're a sought after speaker. The first time I heard you speak was, I think it was in Prague at
Yeah.
one of my early SCCE conferences. And you're often speaking, including in this podcast, not in your first language. And I am very, very appreciative of that. So it can't always be easy. But what advice do you have for women who want to increase their public presence and their speaking? Because I think it's amazing. You could go do this in 20 minutes in French. Much easier.
Okay, I have fun advices and the more serious ones.
Mhm.
The fun one is that you have to watch Netflix because you have shows in different languages. I've been watching shows in Spanish and my Spanish has improved a lot.
Yep.
I also attend a public speaking club, which is a member of Toastmasters, which is an American organization. And it's really fantastic to be more at ease when you speak in public. And we are lucky enough that in Paris, half of the clubs are in English. So that's also interesting. You have to be able at some point to have some international experience, either during your studies or during your work, travel, again, as I said before. And maybe something more specific for women is that maybe you have to show your management that you are good at listening the employees and good at listening to the foreign employees, understanding the differences, the different cultures, so that you managed more easily the communication with the foreign entities. I think that's where we may be better than men.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Especially one of the things that I've learned with our global employees is it's really important, especially if it's a serious conversation, even when they have English ability, to offer translators or someone else there, not just for the language comfort, but a cultural comfort, because I can't not be an American compliance lady that shows up, but I can acknowledge what might make somebody feel more comfortable speaking to me or make it easier for them.
Yeah. Yeah. If I can share an experience I had a few weeks ago, I was in a Latin American country, and they had told me to prepare all the questions in English because not everybody understands Spanish.
Right.
But some of the employees were not fluent enough. And then, so at some point, I asked them whether they wanted me to speak in Spanish. And they said yes. So I did it. I did it although all my questions were in English and I had to translate them on the spot. And I'm not as fluent in Spanish, but the point was that they were more confident and they told me much more than if I had done it in English. So that was the most interesting part of the change.
That is, and I've learned that too. When when I've been doing investigations in Latin America, I always have somebody that is a native speaker, because I'm not. I can understand a little, but not enough. And giving the people the option, and also often reminding people that it's okay to speak in Spanish. I'm okay with it. Don't feel like you're letting me down. I'd rather have you comfortable and be with people you trust. And that, I think, has a real help down the line for others as well, for them to know that at least you acknowledge your limitation in that. And I'll give any of the young professionals, before we go on, start doing languages as early as you possibly can. It's the older you get, the harder it gets, but it's so important. So thank you, though, Maria, for having your amazing English and spending time with me. And I hope I get to see you again in person soon. That was so much fun.
Soon. I'm sure we're going to see each other soon.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa.
Au revoir et merci.
Au revoir. À bientôt.